Now, that's better. Yeah, it's such a delight to be a part of this celebration, isn't it? And I feel like my heart's already so full from all those testimonies. It's just wonderful. God is amazing, the way he works in our lives. It's all so unique, but so incredibly perfect, everything that he does. So congratulations to those people being baptized. I celebrate with you. I was baptized. I was not quite as young as Noah. When I got baptized here at Danesford at the old swimming pool down over there somewhere. It's been knocked down now, I think. I think I was 17. And I'd been following the Lord with my whole heart for about a year. I had my whole life ahead of me. I had absolutely no idea where that journey would take me. But I want to talk about that journey. I want to talk about that walk that we have. I begin with the first slide. Start with a joke. At the age of 65, my grandmother started walking 5 miles a day. She's now 92, and we have no idea where she is. I love that. I love that picture of that she just keeps walking. She keeps going. Yeah, even in her old age, she keeps going. And that's part of the message that I have for you today. Not to do with old age, but the keep going bit. Life is a journey, and that's been mentioned several times already today. And it's a journey we walk every day, the choices we make every day, just like the poem. We can only walk forward. We can't go back. We don't get a do-over. We can't reset the clock. We can only decide what we do with the day that God gives us, however many days they are. So I want to focus today on walking with God. Walking out our life journey with God by our side. Someone mentioned that God is with us. And the Bible often talks about this idea of people walking with him. We are encouraged to walk humbly, to walk faithfully, to walk in obedience with God. We hear about personalities like Enoch and his great-grandson Noah. They both, we are told, walked with God. Now, it's a little phrase, but it says a lot about how close they were to their God. Enoch was apparently so close that he walked with God all the way into eternity. He kind of skipped the death part, apparently. Don't quite know how that works, but that's what the Bible says. I want to bring our attention to a passage in Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is a prophet, and God speaks through a prophet to his people. I've just picked this portion of 43. I'll just read it to you. Because this is what God is talking about. He describes people walking with him. But now, this is what the Lord says. He who created you, Jacob, he who formed you, Israel. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Now, of course, God is speaking to his people, Israel, at the time, to his nation, to his people, to his children. But haven't we been adopted into God's family?
Amen.
We're also God's children. And because our life is now lived in Jesus, we have an inheritance of these promises as well, along with the nation of Israel. So what does God say to us? Well, first of all, he says, I created you. He's our creator. He thought about us. He planned exactly every minute detail about who we are, our makeup, in our physicality, but our personality, our time in history that we were born, everything. He created us. And then he formed us. Jacob, it mentions in Isaiah, now Jacob, the man, became Israel through a process of formation and transformation that God did over a number of years in him. Because Jacob was born to carry the promise. But Jacob, the man, wasn't able to carry it in himself. He needed some work on his character, his personality, and he needed experience. So through those years, God formed Jacob into Israel so he could be the man that he was born to be, so he could carry the promise. He could take on the role that he was born to do. And God does the same with us. He forms us. He doesn't just create us and say, there you go, enjoy life. He continues to form us and to shape us throughout our life, particularly if we allow him to. And then he doesn't stop there. He says, I redeemed you. How wonderful is that? We are redeemed. We are bought and paid for. We are saved. God paid an incredible price for us of his son. And we now belong to him. Our life is not our own. Once we have surrendered to him, our life is in his hands. We now live in Jesus. And then, even more, he says, I've summoned you. I've called you. We are called by our name. Now, that's our collective name, children of God, but also individually. Again, he knows us so personally. He knows our name. And each of us is called by him. And then he finishes off by saying, you're mine. Isn't it wonderful to belong to God? It's the most precious, safe place to be. And after all this that God has done for us, he says, therefore, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, I won't let it sweep over you. When you walk through fire, I won't let it burn you. The fires will not set you ablaze. He goes with us because we are his. The journey is not easy, this journey of life. Actually, he's saying, expect difficulty, expect challenge. It's part of life. Now, we might not physically go through water and fire, but there are some days we feel like we're drowning. And there are some situations that feel that we are being burned alive in this furnace of pressure. God promises to be with us because we are his. And he says you will pass through. It's a season. You won't remain in those difficult situations. He will pass through with you. He will carry you through to the other side. Now, I wanted to talk actually about one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, as an example of someone who went through an incredible journey, a lot of hardship. Most of us will never go through the challenges that he went through. Some of us perhaps have. But we know a lot about his story. It takes up 14 chapters in Genesis, so there's a lot of details to work on. I'm not going to go through the whole story. I'm going to summarize it. You can read it. It's worth a read. It's a really good story. So, quickly, the summary of Joseph's life. He was the 11th son of Jacob. The family were shepherds, so therefore he was a shepherd. He was his dad's favorite. That, of course, caused trouble in the family. His older brothers didn't like that fact. I can understand that. Now, Joseph had dreams, and he was able to interpret them. And he had two particular dreams when he was young, a young teenager. And he unwisely, and probably with a bit of pride, shared them with his family, who were not too impressed. Now, I find it interesting that in our Western culture, we just go, whatever, you know. We wouldn't think twice about a silly dream. But this is not Western culture. They don't dismiss the dreams as just the imaginings of a little boy. They actually realize, oh my goodness, God speaks through dreams. This could well come true. And that's what freaked them out. I think that's a challenge to us in the Western world, that we perhaps should learn to pay attention to our dreams a little bit more. And through the Holy Spirit, allow God to speak to us and interpret these dreams. Because God can and does speak through dreams sometimes. We know that at the age of 17, he was sent by his dad to go and check on his brothers and then bring a report back to his dad. He never returned home. that day when he eventually found his brothers. They were very displeased that their little brother was checking up on them again. So they roughed him up and they threw him down a dry well. They considered murdering him, and then they decided, better not. We'll just traffic him. So they sold him into slavery. And he was transported away from everything he had known, his family, his culture, never to return to a completely different land. He was sold in the slave market in Egypt, and he was a slave in Potiphar's household. He was the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And we read that God was with Joseph. Now, it doesn't look like God's with him, with all this stuff is happening to him. But it says God was with Joseph. And after a while, Joseph's skill and character was recognized, and he was promoted to run Potiphar's household. Then years went by. Now, Potiphar's wife had obviously noted Joseph was growing into a strapping young man, and she had her eyes on him. And I can imagine it was a really difficult, tricky situation for Joseph, because I'm sure, it happened multiple times that she tried to catch his eye. And one day, she cornered him, and he did the only thing that he could do as a slave with no rights. He ran away. He ran from her. She, of course, was frustrated and annoyed and perhaps a bit ashamed, so she made up this story, told her husband that he attacked her. Potiphar went crazy, didn't bother to listen to Joseph and get his side of the story, but threw him straight in prison. That was it, threw him away. Years passed by in prison. After a while, God obviously favored Joseph in prison and was with him, and his skills and character were noticed, and he ended up running the prison as a slave still and a prisoner. And then years went by. One day, two people entered Joseph's prison. They were servants in the palace, but they had somehow displeased Pharaoh, so they were thrown in prison. And these two people had dreams. Joseph interpreted the dreams. One of them ended up being executed, and the other one went back into the service of the Pharaoh in the palace. And Joseph said before the man left, he said, "Remember me. Please, get me out of here." Well, he was promptly forgotten. 2 more years went by when Joseph was rotting in prison. Then one day, Pharaoh had a dream, and nobody could understand what it was. They knew it had meaning, but they couldn't understand what it was. Suddenly, the servant remembered, I met a guy in prison who could interpret dreams. Joseph was pulled out of the prison, cleaned off, and presented to Pharaoh. And Joseph promptly then interpreted the dream. And then, interestingly, he then goes on and further and gives advice on how to apply the meaning of the dream. God was with Joseph and gave him favor in Pharaoh's eyes. Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph that he instantly promoted him to court, gave him favor and privilege, and put him in charge of all Egypt. Can you see the pattern? Years went by. There was a famine in the land, and that famine eventually brought Joseph's brothers down into Egypt to buy grain to take back to their family. Joseph was suddenly confronted. Can you imagine the emotions and the memories that came up? How they treated him, and all the cruelty that he had endured because of what his brothers had done. He really struggled during that time. But then Joseph has an opportunity to look back at his life, and he suddenly realizes the purposes of God have been working out all the time. Even in the midst of great hardship and struggle and injustice, God had been working through Joseph to bring him to this point, to save his family. Joseph is then able to offer forgiveness to his brothers, and there's reconciliation in the family. The whole family then gathers together in Egypt. They're given the best land. They're given privilege. They are protected from the famine. And there they grow strong and they increase in number. God is with the whole family and gives them favor. Joseph was able to look back on his life and he saw God at work in his journey. And he said this to his brothers: "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." He saw the hand of God, the acts of God in his life. You know, time can give us perspective on some of the stuff that happens in our life that can seem so random. As I said, we only travel one direction, but we can look back and see what God has done. And it's interesting, the Hebrews, they have an interesting idea of time. I'm not sure I completely understand it, but there's one concept about time where they're actually walking backwards into their future, which seems really an awkward way to do it, because if you tried walking backwards, it's awkward. You know, why don't you just turn around and walk straight? Well, the idea behind walking backwards into your future is that we can see our history. We've lived it. It's a landscape that's familiar to us. So we can look back and we can see all that God has done. The Hebrews always looked at history from the perspective of God's acts. So don't ever look back without that perspective, that lens of God has been at work. Otherwise you can get in trouble. So they could see their history, and then that then helped them to walk into their future, which is actually unknown. Most of our future we have no idea. We can see perhaps a few steps ahead as God allows. So that's why to them they have this concept of walking backwards into their future. Another way of looking at it, perhaps a bit more familiar to us, is like driving. My dear husband at the moment is taking driving lessons. He's had a license since he was 15 in America, but he has to take a UK license. So he is really trying hard to get to knuckle down all these very strict rules. And I go driving with him as his licensed driver. I sit with him in the L-plate car. We drive around Stoke-on-Trent. And so he has to do all this, like looking in the mirror, these like the 5-point checks behind the shoulder, the mirror, the rear view mirror, the other mirror, looking behind, all of this in order to pass his test. And this reminds me of this, that of course, when you're driving, you need to focus on where you're going. You need to see what's ahead of you, but you also need to be aware of what is around you and what's behind you. And it's that same concept of like our history can then help us walk into our future. God is committed to shaping us, to forming us, to help us to become who we were born to be, so we can do what we were born to do, because we're called, each of us. First of all, of course, we're called to glorify God. That's our number one call. To show off Jesus to the world, how spectacular he is, how marvelous, how incredible he is. And because each of us is unique, we can display a unique aspect of who Jesus is to the world. And God and others can then read that message in us, in our lives, the choices that we make, who we are, and how we speak, and things like that. Now, this picture, I did mention this some months ago, referred to it quickly, and I said, at some point, I'll come back to it. Well, today is the day I'm coming back to it, give you a bit more information on this, but there's a lot more. I'm going to give you information. Don't worry, though. If you're really interested, I do have things printed out, the information, so you don't need to take notes and things. So, the way God forms us, even though it's unique for each of us, there is actually a universal sort of plan or pattern that he tends to use. And it can be pictured like this. There are many different versions, but I like this particular model. It's only a model, so it's not perfect, but it can help us understand the way God is working in our lives. There are 4 stages of outward progression, and in between those are 3 valleys, we call them, or times of often crisis, difficulty, major ones in our life. The outward 4 stages of progression, of growth, are more to do with outward development. You're learning skills, you're getting experience, you're perhaps gaining influence. But then the 3 crises or valley times are where God actually wants to work on the inner you, your inner life. Because it's no good having all the skills without the character. You don't last very long. And you usually end up hurting a bunch of people as well. God doesn't want that. He wants to develop us in skill, but also in character. So we have these times where he actually sort of withdraws us almost into a place because he wants to work on our character. He wants to develop intimacy with him, because those are the things that will sustain us for the long journey. Because you can see where he wants us to get to, into that calling, that place of fulfillment, where we are being transformed into the image of Jesus, and we're functioning in the calling that he has given us. Now, I just quickly want to describe that through my experience. Now, it's just as an example. So, for instance, the natural progression is not to do with age. It starts from really the time when you submit to the Lord, from the time of lordship. And that's different for everybody. It can be as young as a child, or you can be old, 50, doesn't really matter. And that usually lasts between 1 and 9 years. And that's to do where time where you're growing in your natural abilities. You find out what you're good at. And for me, I love dancing, but I also, interestingly, leadership roles kind of landed in my lap. I didn't go looking for them because I was actually a very insecure person. I was petrified of talking to people, even praying out loud just frightened me. So anything to do in front of people other than dancing, I was like, no way. No, I definitely don't want to do it. But these certain leadership roles did actually come my way when I was a teenager. At 18, the bottom dropped out of my world. I failed my A-levels. That was like, I went completely flat as a pancake. But that was as I entered that valley of dependence. God actually withdrew me for a while because he had some stuff he needed to work on me. And that's a period of about 2.5 years generally, where God does work on character development. It's usually through a major failure or adversity, and you often feel quite isolated. And then, eventually, you get into this preparation time that can be quite long. For me, that was the time where I became a missionary in YWAM. I got some healing. But then kids came along, and there was this long period of motherhood and homeschooling where I was actually quite home-based. I did do some missionary work in my free time. I did a little bit of speaking, but again, it petrified me. But I was mostly at home. And this can happen with people. God, he's developing skills in you, but it doesn't necessarily in your particular area of calling what he ultimately wants you to be. It can be general skills, like me. In motherhood, my goodness, that is a great training ground. Boy, it's the toughest job I've ever had, but the most amazing time. And that really refined me on the inside. And then eventually you hit this valley of wholeness, as God is trying to complete this process in you. And for me, there was some family difficulties that sort of stopped us in our tracks, and we needed to regroup for a while. More healing, particularly in the area of my insecurities. But each of these valleys, I had times, such incredible encounters with God, that it just, in that isolation, that desert period, God became so real to me. And it's like a time with him, I left those times different. It marked me forever. I became different because of the times that I'd spent with him. And then eventually in this releasing period, that was for me when my kids got a bit older. I had more time on my hands. And so I started to do more public ministry. I was speaking a little bit more. By then, I was a bit more secure and willing to try and do some things. And life was going really well. And you can see how this progression, it's going up and up and up. And I've actually felt that way. I was feeling like, yeah, finally, things are making sense. I'm moving on and I'm doing this. I'm taking on leadership roles and I'm feeling good about myself. Well, then I suddenly hit the valley of identity. Boom, my life blew up 3 years ago. And after 30 years of being in YWAM, a mission organization, as a missionary, we had to leave Slovakia where we were serving, and I was landed back here where I hadn't lived for 30 years. I lost my tribe. I loved being part of Youth with a Mission and the friends that I'd made there. And suddenly I was sort of adrift here in technically my home, but I hadn't been here for so long. It took quite a while to reconnect being here. But at the same time, through the difficulty, it gave me an opportunity to reconnect with my family, to reconnect with this church, which has been wonderful. Gave me back dancing in my life, just like, yes. Honestly, I'm probably somewhere in that valley of identity right now. And even though it's difficult and some of these changes and challenges are kind of jarring, God is with me. I know that. I have that experience as I look back. And this kind of model, it's helped me not to freak out when stuff hits the fan, when things go wrong. Because it's like, whoa, I realize, okay, God, you're doing something. You're with me. What's going on? And asking him from his perspective what's going on. And the last part was the fulfillment, which I haven't got to yet, so I can't tell you about. But apparently, that is the time when God has finished forming this message in you. He's molded and refined your personality and your character. And you're now strong enough and ready to move into a place where what you do and who you are become one and the same. And it's this wonderful dovetail experience. Not necessarily more responsibility, because most people hit this around 40s and 50s and they're thinking about retiring and putting their feet up. It's not about doing more, but it's actually about being more effective, the influence, and leaving a legacy that will go on through the generations. So I just wanted to explain that a little bit more. There's a lot more to it, but I'm not going to go into it now. And if you go to the next slide, if we put Joseph's story that I told you into this model, it looks something like this. And you can see it follows a similar pattern. And as I say, God is committed to forming, shaping Jesus in us. And he will take this life, however long he gives us, to form that message of who Jesus is in us. And at the same time, developing our skills and our character. If you go to the next slide, I just thought, quickly, what's some application? Because that was a lot of information. So, how does that help us right now? Well, firstly, it's helpful to look back, a bit like the Hebrews looking back at their history. Look to see the pattern of God's works in your life and recognize that it's not random, it's not chance, it's not just life happens. God wouldn't let it happen if he couldn't use it for your development and for his glory. So every part of it, the painful bits, the difficult bits, the confusing bits, as well as the high points, the successes, God's hand is there. Ask him to give you eyes to see him at work, because that, knowing your history, can then help you see how God is working right now. And that's the second point. Get God's perspective on where you are right now. Are you feeling like, yeah, I'm in the zone, I'm like in the groove, this is going really well, I'm developing my skills, and it just feels like an easy road? Or are you actually in a time of struggle? And what is God doing in those times? Is he developing your skill? Or is he molding your inner life? Is he drawing you into a deeper relationship with him? It's good to know what he's doing. And my experience is, he usually, if we ask him and we're patient, and then we're walking with him, that means in communion, he wants to tell us. And that's the third part. Walk on, keep walking, like that old grandma, just keep walking. For as long as God gives us, keep walking with him. Even when it doesn't make sense, just keep walking, trusting in him because he's promised to be with us through it all. In thankfulness and rejoicing, just make sure that we don't hold on to bitterness. Be like Joseph. Let go. And if you struggle with that, God wants to help you. It's part of that molding process, is to help you not just understand what's gone on, but release you from the past hurts and the burdens so you can be free to walk into your future. Some days we'll feel like we're walking on the mountain tops in the clouds. Some days we'll feel like we're trudging through mud. But whether we're walking on water with Jesus or walking through fire, Jesus has promised to be with us through it all. Yeah. Do I have 2 more minutes? 2 more minutes? Okay, one more thing. I wanted to share some journaling I did with the Lord. Because I like to ask him questions. And just as 2 minutes to reflect on what you've heard this morning and see what God wants specifically to speak to you, I would ask that we just close our eyes and I will read the question and God's answer to me, and just have your heart open to God. Father, what does it mean to walk with you all the days of my life? My darling one, as we walk, we keep pace with one another. Moving together is more important than how fast or how slow. As we walk together, our communion grows and your understanding increases. My presence is your light, my voice your guide. I enjoy this journey together and seeing you develop. I know the challenges that you will face and the breakthroughs you will have because of them. I've got just what you need, whether it's wisdom, courage, or patience. Together, you will not only make it through, but you will emerge radiant. My love, don't be afraid of trouble or difficulty. Every trial you meet is placed not to trip you up, but to elevate you, to take you higher and further than you ever thought possible. Together, no obstacle is too high or any valley too dark for me to guide you safely through. Don't draw back, but dive into this wonderful adventure called life together. Amen.
Amen.